Hello, it's the Philosopher's Zone, and it could be the end of the world as we know it.
So we're reaching the end of liberalism in the sense of achievement. We see the replacement of what had been fairly authoritative cultural practices with now even more authoritative and more comprehensive forms of state control. As for what comes next, I think this is a perilous time. There's no doubt that this is a perilous time. And we should be very wary of celebrating the end of liberalism because what may replace it could be even worse.
Scott Stevens is with Patrick Deneen of the University of Notre Dame in Indiana.
Well, we've reached the end of the line. Of this series on political philosophy, I mean. But perhaps we're reaching the end of something else, too. Liberal democracy can seem like the sort of political order that's bound to stand the test of time. It relies on no grand vision and no utopian goal. It demands no great sacrifice and little common agreement on the part of citizens. In fact, it simply requires that people be precisely what they already are: self-interested, self-directing, self-acquisitive individuals. Liberalism is, after all, nothing if not modest. And yet, almost miraculously, it claims that this liberal modesty, this resigned view of human fallibility and self-interest, can produce a harmonious, just, prosperous, perhaps even good society. And thus liberalism can succeed where fascism and socialism have utterly failed. Sounds too good to be true? Well, for Patrick Deneen, that's probably because it is. So let's begin by trying to understand what exactly political liberalism is.
I would describe it as the first of the modern ideologies. It joined eventually the other ideologies of communism and fascism as the three great ideological contenders in the modern period. And by ideology, I mean a theory of politics that deliberately set out to change human reality in order to, in some senses, force or shape human reality to conform to those ideas. The ideas that liberalism sought to shape or to influence reality began in its earliest phases as a philosophy that sought to extract human beings, at least theoretically, from histories and contexts and traditions, and even a kind of self-definition of themselves understood through family relationships, through generational ties and bonds, through the bonds of place and culture and tradition. And it was called liberalism, or it came to be called liberalism, precisely because it understood itself to be a belief system that, if embraced, would liberate people from what was viewed as the great constraints upon human liberty. These various ways in which selves would be defined through these histories and cultures and places and traditions and family ties and generations. And so liberalism begins then as this effort to liberate people from these contexts and develops as an historical ideological entity into, of course, a system of government, into a close affinity with an economic system that similarly seeks to extract people from particular markets into one thing called a market, and which develops also into a philosophy that eventually instantiates itself into reality as one occupied by people who largely understand themselves to be autonomous, self-shaping, self-making individuals.
So liberalism is characterized by a kind of freedom from the state. Unlike other political systems, it claims to give individuals back to themselves instead of enlisting them in some larger project. But, Patrick, this relationship between the individual and the state isn't quite so cut and dried, is it?
From the very earliest moments of the liberal project, from the philosophical project that becomes the political project, it's well understood in liberal philosophy and eventually in liberal politics that one actually needs a strong state to establish the conditions that make the liberation of the individual possible from all of these kinds of contexts and traditions and cultural settings and even familial and generational settings. And this is kind of the great irony in some senses of liberalism, because on the surface it claims to be and justifies itself as a theory of limited government, as a theory that limits the role of the state. And in one sense, we could say it does that because it understands itself as a philosophy that now brackets questions of what kind of life one should lead. It brackets the question of the good, to use the Rawlsian term. And instead, it says we are going to encourage the creation of a society that allows for the full liberation of the individual from any arbitrary defining set of relationships. But in order to achieve that end, one actually needs a very powerful state. So on the one hand, liberalism rightly understands itself to have limited ends, which is to say it is not attempting to define a theory of the good that is uniform for all human beings. But within that limited end, it actually has to accrue enormous power and enormous ability to reshape society in the image and likeness of the autonomous individual.
Now, let's just take liberalism on its own terms here. What exactly does it promise? I mean, what hope is supposed to accrue from this liberation from the constraints of custom and tribe and family and tradition?
In the most generous terms, liberalism did indeed allow for human beings to pursue life ends, life choices, forms of self-definition that were no longer, in very fundamental ways, given in older aristocratic or traditional society. And so when we typically think of what a pre-liberal world looks like, we think of a world in which, for example, think of very common names in the English tradition. Names like Weaver and Taylor and Smith. These weren't simply just common names. These were literally what your career was. These were literally what your work was, and what your work was literally the name that you inherited from your father. What liberalism does, among other things, is to liberate us from some form of definition of self that was handed down to us without our choice. At the heart of liberalism, then, is a theory of consent that gives place of priority to individual choice. And I think for those within or who justify the liberal tradition, they see this as its central achievement. What I would submit, at least as a further reflection on the achievement of liberalism, is that what it also achieves in doing exactly this, in liberating people from a kind of given definition, is that it also liberates us in some ways from obligations and duties, and in some ways a kind of gratitude to an inheritance. So the very thing that it achieves, the liberation from inheritances of a previous generation, also liberates us to pursue our own ends without regard or even requiring to have a kind of attitude of gratitude or inheritance that I think underlies what we now see happening, which is the separation of the strong and successful from the weak and those who are not able to achieve success within the context of liberal society.
So it's not so much that obligations no longer exist within liberal social orders. Instead, it's that every such obligation is subordinated to a prior act of choice. We choose by what and by whom we are bound.
We take on obligations to the extent that we choose or consent to them. This is actually a point that John Locke makes in the second treatise on government. Locke argues that each human being, in a sense, at the time they reach the age of maturity, makes a conscious decision of whether they are going to stay within a kind of familial embrace, whether that means taking on the family business, or even having a kind of relationship of inheritance with one's parents, or whether one is going to completely create a new life for oneself. So what Locke argues is that it's not only that we theoretically enter into the state of nature in some prehistory in order to create human society and human government. In fact, each of us, in a moment when we reach the age of maturity, enter the state of nature to choose whether we will take on a set of relationships in a kind of deep and formative sense, or whether we will simply completely alter ourselves, completely change ourselves, reject our tradition, reject our inheritance. So, of course, what this has the effect of doing is prioritizing choice, prioritizing consent, that even the person who embraces an attitude of gratitude and obligation has only done so through the process of consent.
Okay, but even this capacity to choose, to fashion one's own life and to bend one's destiny to one's own will, that assumes a kind of baseline personal wealth, doesn't it? I mean, to what extent does liberalism rely on economic prosperity?
I think there can be no doubt, and again, to invoke John Locke, especially in his very famous chapter on property, essentially predicates his vision of liberal society upon an economy in which one has constant growth and activity, prosperity, growing forms of economic activity, which is driven primarily by a class of people that he calls, and these are his words, the industrious and the rational. These qualities, being industrious and being rational, become salient in a liberal economy, and particularly in a capitalist economy. In a pre-capitalist economy, it's not particularly salient whether one is industrious and rational, or whether one is, as he describes it, querulous and contentious, kind of a busybody complainer, in other words. He argues that an economic system in which you have ongoing and constant economic transformation and change, the increase of value and wealth, will be one in which the industrious and the rational will constantly gain, and in which the querulous and contentious will become ever more querulous and contentious. And he recognizes that this is a kind of recipe for political unrest and potential revolution. He's the first to recognize this. But he makes the following argument, which is that a society that is dynamic and in which there's a kind of growing prosperity for the entire society will be one in which even the querulous and contentious, in some ways the losers of the economic system, will be more satisfied by what they gain than they will be unsatisfied by the growing levels of inequality. To use a phrase that was made famous by Ronald Reagan, Locke seems to suggest that a rising tide will raise all boats, and as a result, even those who are not in the elite of, or the most direct winners, in a sense, of this system, nevertheless will become supporters of it because they will see it as to their advantage as well.
Patrick Deneen, Professor of Constitutional Studies. He's with Scott Stephens on the final leg of a journey through some big ideas of modern political philosophy, landing on liberalism, here on the Philosopher's Zone.
So, Patrick, is liberalism just a form of political technology that's particularly well suited to the way that human beings really are? Or is it an active political program that sets out to fashion, to shape a particular kind of human being?
One of the things that liberalism achieves in practice, but which you can already see in its theory, is to reduce, in some ways, the ontological points of reality to two entities, the individual on the one hand and the state on the other. And what the theory of liberalism posits becomes, in some ways, the kind of driving force as it becomes a political reality, which is to either seek the elimination or the weakening and the effectual replacement of anything that is not fundamentally either the ontological reality and experience of the individual or the ontological existence of the state. And we can see this in the kind of dual reinforcement that you see. And I began by describing how the liberal state becomes the guarantor and the enabler of the liberation of the individual. That the individual in some ways is the creation of the powerful state. And what's ironic about this is that liberal theory posits the individual exists in the state of nature before the creation of the state. But as a practical matter, as a political matter, what actually happens is that that theory drives a set of dynamics in which the state accrues power to create the individual that now begins to resemble that human being that exists in theory in the state of nature. The irony then is that one needs a very powerful state and a very extensive apparatus, a kind of construction and a set of artifices to create what's supposed to be, in theory, that which exists by nature. But autonomy doesn't exist by nature. It's something that has to, in some ways, be supported by a very extensive state apparatus. But then notice the other part of this dynamic, which Alexis de Tocqueville is particularly perceptive and discerning. What Tocqueville recognizes that as people are afforded this sense of liberation, They will for a time enjoy it. It will become something that they embrace and that they enjoy. But what actually results from this condition is a pervasive form of weakness. That when people find themselves in need, as people inevitably do, when they need someone to turn to for assistance, what they will find is that they can no longer turn to their neighbors. They can no longer turn to their communities. It will be increasingly difficult for them to turn to their families, given the kind of mobility and distance that people will inevitably find themselves. And so Tocqueville, at the end of Democracy in America, describes a condition in which individuals will only be able to turn to one entity alone that stands above all others, and that's that other ontological point of the state. And he describes then a condition of a new form of despotism, what he calls democratic despotism, which is not the old form of despotism, the oppression of people by a kind of powerful entity that seeks their oppression. It's rather a kind of soft despotism in which people invite now the all-powerful, all-encompassing state to fill in for the gaps and weaknesses of their lives. And so a theory that begins by extolling its liberative ambitions, the ambition to liberate the individual from all of these old traditions and old ways of life, results in a kind of new and unseen, perhaps potentially incurable form of despotism. And this is, of course, the irony, the great irony of Tocqueville's great work, Democracy in America, is Democracy in America ends by suggesting that democracy will end with the end of democracy.
Liberalism promises, it seems to me, to bypass human agency. So there can, for instance, be civic peace even when citizens no longer share what Adam Ferguson called the bands of affection. And there can be a good or even a just society without the individual members themselves being virtuous.
Well, this is in some ways the essence of the liberal faith, which is that you can posit the existence of a near infinite number of autonomous individuals all working in pursuit of their own interest, and yet out of that kind of cacophony and variety of pursuits, one can nevertheless expect and hope for the creation of a society that is in some senses harmonious, at the very least has a kind of order and even logic to it, what of course Adam Smith calls the invisible hand, which creates a market, and the market which itself is a kind of organized form or way of harnessing self-interest. But of course liberalism is also defined by the need to recognize that a society of autonomous individuals pursuing their own interest is one that will increasingly be driven by people who in some fundamental way aren't free. In the classical understanding of liberty, of course, the classical understanding of liberty emphasizes liberty as a form of self-rule or self-government, the governance of our base desires, the governance of our lusts, of our pride, of our concupiscence, of our desire for material things. The danger, and which comes to be recognized by a number of thinkers even within the liberal tradition, is that people will become, in a sense, slaves to their own desires and passions. The problem is that liberalism doesn't have a mechanism by which it can call for people to act in accordance with a kind of virtue of self-governance. And this is why I think you get a kind of disconnect with someone like Rawls, who on the one hand sees the real dangers of a liberal society as one in which people are fundamentally indifferent to the fates of others, that they are fundamentally disconnected from the fates of their fellow citizens, but which nevertheless requires a kind of willingness for us to consider what is the common good, and why Rawls then develops a theory in which we, for some reason, we put ourselves behind what he calls a veil of ignorance to reflect on the kind of society that we would want. The problem that has always seemed to me to be at the heart of Rawls's philosophy is that he never tells us why a liberal human being would want to put themselves behind the veil of ignorance in the first place. It's premised upon a belief of a kind of civic peace between self-seeking individuals. But on the other hand, it kind of has a presupposition of individuals who somehow act on a kind of benevolent, self-abnegating way without any explanation for what motivation they would have for even doing that in the first place.
Patrick, I'm going to ask you to whip out your crystal ball. What do you think comes next? Externally, the world can no longer keep supplying the material resources that bankroll liberalism's promise of endless prosperity. Internally, there is a kind of crisis of democratic political will, where electorates are proving increasingly unwilling to back hard political decisions that would constrain their own freedoms for the sake of the well-being of others now or the well-being of generations in the future.
On the one hand, what strikes me is that we are seeing the fruition of this roughly 5-century-old project. It took a long time for it to come to fruition because there were many other traditions, there were many other practices and ways of life. There was, of course, the entire Christian inheritance in the West. There is still a kind of legacy and after effects of aristocracy that exist and persist for a long time, a kind of noblesse oblige among the upper classes in some ways. There are many countervailing factors, and again, Tocqueville is very good at identifying many of these. He sees these residues of older traditions lasting for a long time into a society that nevertheless becomes more and more in keeping with its own internal philosophical and political logic, to the point in which it will actually finally eliminate all of those countervailing or contradictory ways of life. So we're reaching the end of liberalism in the sense of achievement, of the accomplishment of its end. But this very achievement is also, we could say, in a kind of paradoxical way, also leading us to the end of liberalism, which is showing us its very unviability and its unsustainability, because it ends up delivering, in some ways, both what it promises, but the opposite of what people expect. And one of those aspects, of course, is a society of a new, extensive, and perhaps more perfected aristocracy than the one that liberalism originally displaced. We see the replacement of what had been fairly authoritative cultural practices with now even more authoritative and more comprehensive forms of state control. We see the replacement of a society in which you had a leadership class, typically an aristocratic class, replaced by a society in which we have essentially a new form of an oligarchy or a plutocracy. So all of the things that we come to expect liberalism will deliver are in some senses the opposite of what it promised, but are in fact its realization. So it seems to me that we are on the one hand facing the end of liberalism in terms of its achievement, and we're also facing the end of liberalism in terms of what I think will be the ongoing willingness of many people to support its various forms. As for what comes next, I think this is a perilous time. There's no doubt that this is a perilous time. And we should be very wary of celebrating the end of liberalism, because what may replace it could be even worse. This is why I think it's necessary to think very hard. The task before us may be now less shoring up a kind of contradictory system and way of life, and to begin thinking of new forms, and begin thinking of new ways and new conceptions of politics, while recognizing that to do so is also to acknowledge that we may have very perilous times ahead of us. But I would say unless we do that hard work of thinking to what might come after liberalism, we will face an after liberalism whether we want to or not. And if we don't take seriously the contemplation of what's next, then what will come after will almost surely be at least worse. And if it's not worse, it will leave us with this form of liberalism, as far as the eye can see, that I think will be nearly unbearable.